Micro Center is already under fire, with buyers accusing the store of forcing bundles, selling risky open box parts, and pushing protection plans that don't actually protect the customer. These aren't rumors or isolated rants. They're documented complaints coming from different cities, different stores, and different buyers, all describing the same experiences. CPUs that are suddenly out of stock, unless you buy more. Open box parts that arrive damaged, incomplete, or dead. Returns that flip the blame back onto the customer. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. And in this video, we're exposing exactly how that pattern works, why it's becoming more common, and how a store PC builders trusted for years quietly changed without telling anyone. Because the real scandal isn't one bad interaction or one angry post online. It's how many people saw the warning signs and didn't want to believe them. The first red flags. Nobody wanted to believe. For a long time, the complaints didn't sound like a scandal. They sounded like excuses. One bad employee, one unlucky visit, one customer who didn't understand how PC parts work. That's how most people, especially loyal Micro Center shoppers, explained it away. Because when you've trusted a store for years, your brain looks for reasons not to believe something is wrong. But then the same posts started appearing again and again. Different subreddits, different forums, different cities, all describing nearly identical experiences. A customer walks in for a CPU they saw online, only to be told it's technically available, just not by itself. Another buyer describes being rushed at checkout, nudged toward add-ons they never asked for. Someone else talks about an open box deal that felt off the moment they got home. On their own, each story sounded minor. Together, they started to feel uncomfortable. The details lined up too cleanly, too consistently, to be random. People weren't just saying they had a bad experience. They were saying the experience felt strangely familiar, like they were being guided down the same path whether they wanted to be or not. That's when the tone shifted. Confusion turned into frustration, frustration into suspicion, and suspicion into anger. And this wasn't coming from first-time shoppers. These were long-time builders, people who had spent thousands at Micro Center over the years, suddenly saying the same thing. This doesn't feel like the same store anymore. That's when the red flags stopped being noise. Because when the most loyal, forgiving customers all start telling the same story, it's rarely coincidence. It's the early stage of something breaking. And the clearest place to see that break was in the one deal Micro Center was most famous for, the bundle. Because once you look closely at how those deals started changing, the rest of the scandal begins to make sense. The bundle trap that turned deals into leverage. Here's what Micro Center built its legend on: the bundle deal. For years, the play was simple. You walked in, grabbed a CPU, paired it with a compatible motherboard, and you got a discount that made you feel like you just outsmarted the whole market. People on PC forums talk about Micro Center like it's a cheat code for CPU pricing, especially when bundled with a board. But then buyers started noticing something subtle. The bundle stopped feeling like a bonus and started feeling like a gate. One of the most common complaints isn't the bundle exists. It's the way the bundle controls the options. Fewer flexible combos, more pre-packaged deals, and less of that old build what you want freedom. A Tom's Hardware user put it bluntly. They said Micro Center did away with the long-running $20 off motherboard with a compatible CPU style deal and shifted toward a smaller set of package deals instead. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this is the part that makes people feel played. You'll see the CPU price online, you'll plan your whole build around it, you'll drive out to the store, and then the story changes. On Micro Center's own subreddit, you can find customers describing bundle availability issues and the kind of "this is technically available, but" experience that leaves you feeling like you're negotiating for basic access to parts. The vibe shifts from pick your parts to take the deal we're offering. Then, there's the second layer of the trap. Once you buy a bundle, it can lock your choices after the purchase too. On Micro Center's community forum, staff responses have told customers that if they bought a free motherboard bundle, returning the CPU could mean the motherboard has to be returned as well. So imagine how that plays out in real life. You discover the CPU isn't what you wanted, or you hit a compatibility problem, and suddenly you're not just swapping one item. You're unwinding the entire purchase like a string you can't untangle. And that's why people are furious, because none of this feels like a deal anymore. It feels like leverage. A discount that looks generous on the surface, but underneath it quietly reshapes your choices. What you can buy, what you can return, and how hard it is to back out once you're in. And if you think that's where the risk ends, the next part gets worse, because when buyers try to save money another way, the store's best-kept secret becomes the biggest gamble. Open box. Open box roulette. When discounted means untested. For years, Micro Center's open box section had a reputation almost as strong as its bundles. If you knew what you were doing, this was where you saved real money. Returned but working parts, lightly used boards, GPUs that someone changed their mind on. PC forums used to call it a gold mine. That's why the shift hit people so hard. Across Reddit, Micro Center's own subreddit, and PC building forums, buyers started describing the same experience. Open box parts that clearly shouldn't have been back on the shelf. Motherboards with bent CPU pins, GPUs, missing power adapters or brackets, CPUs tossed back into plastic clamshells with no protection, no explanation, and no warning. One buyer described opening an open box motherboard at home and immediately seeing bent pins. Damage that would have been obvious to anyone who bothered to inspect it. Another said their open box GPU wouldn't even post, forcing a return the same day. Others talk about Wi-Fi antennas missing, I/O shields gone, or critical cables nowhere to be found. And here's the part that keeps coming up in complaint after complaint. Inconsistency. Some stores test open box parts thoroughly. Others barely test them at all. Some clearly label what's missing. Others don't. Buyers say it feels like a roll of the dice. And that's not something you want when you're gambling with $300, $600, or $1,000 components. What changed the tone from annoyance to anger is that customers didn't feel warned. Open box used to mean discounted because it was opened. Now, for many buyers, it feels more like risk quietly transferred to you. You save some money up front, but you absorb the time, stress, and uncertainty if something's wrong. And yes, Micro Center will often take the return. But that's not the point. People aren't upset just because something failed. They're upset because a store built on trust started selling parts that required trust, without earning it first. Because when open box stops feeling like a smart insider move and starts feeling like damage control for the store, the entire relationship changes. And this is where a lot of buyers say the experience takes a darker turn. Because once something goes wrong, once you're holding a bad part, you're suddenly introduced to the most aggressively pushed product in the building. The protection plan. And according to many customers, that's where the imbalance really starts to show. The protection plan. That protects them, not you. If you read through Micro Center complaints online, one moment comes up again and again. The checkout counter. That's where customers say the tone shifts, where a friendly transaction suddenly turns into a pitch, and where the protection plan stops feeling optional. Buyers describe being warned, sometimes bluntly, that PC parts are fragile, that failures are common, and that skipping the plan is a risk, especially on GPUs, motherboards, and CPUs. On Reddit and store review pages, customers say the pitch often feels less like advice and more like pressure. Some describe being asked multiple times after declining. Others say the language is loaded. If anything goes wrong, this is the only way we can help you. For a store that built its reputation on expertise and trust, that framing hits differently. It doesn't feel neutral. It feels like fear being used as a tool. What makes people angry isn't just the upsell. It's what happens when they actually try to use the plan. Complaints describe surprise exclusions, strict interpretation of accidental damage, and situations where buyers thought they were covered, only to be told they weren't. A common theme shows up in reviews. Customers say the plan sounded simple at checkout, but became complicated the moment money was on the line. Several buyers describe the same emotional whiplash. They paid extra for peace of mind, something went wrong, and instead of feeling protected, they felt interrogated, asked how the damage happened, told it might not qualify, redirected to manufacturer warranties they were trying to avoid in the first place. The protection plan didn't remove friction, it added another layer of it. And here's why this matters in the bigger scandal. When you pair risky open box sales with aggressive protection plan pushes, it starts to feel less like customer service and more like damage containment. You sell parts that might come back, then sell insurance against the frustration of buying them. Either way, the store wins twice. That's why so many complaints don't say, "Never buy a protection plan." They say something more damning. "I felt like I was being set up." Set up to doubt your purchase, set up to fear failure, and set up to pay extra just to feel safe in a store that used to make people feel confident by default. And once customers start pushing back, once they say no or question the advice, another shift happens. Because that's when people say the expert tone disappears and the sales pressure becomes impossible to ignore. That's where the next wave of complaints comes in. When expert advice quietly turned into sales pressure. One of Micro Center's biggest selling points has always been the people. Not just employees, experts. Builders trusted them because the advice felt practical, neutral, and rooted in experience, not commission. That's why so many online complaints focus on this chapter of the story. Because for a lot of buyers, this is where the relationship really broke. Across Reddit threads, Google reviews, and PC building forums, customers describe a similar shift. They walk in asking for a specific part, often one they've already researched, and the conversation quickly turns into steering. Different brand, different tier, more expensive option. Sometimes the justification sounds technical, but buyers say the explanation often falls apart the moment they push back or ask follow-up questions. Several customers describe the same uncomfortable moment. Once they decline the recommendation, the tone changes. The conversation gets shorter. The help gets thinner. Some say employees became dismissive, others say they felt rushed, like they were wasting someone's time by not taking the suggestion. A few even describe being told bluntly that their original choice was a bad idea, without a clear reason why. What makes this stand out is how consistent the complaints are. Buyers aren't saying every employee does this. They're saying it happens often, enough to feel systemic. Enough that people start wondering whether the advice is about compatibility or about margin. Enough that experienced builders, people who know exactly what they need, start double-checking everything they're told. Former employees and retail veterans commenting online point to a familiar explanation. Incentives change behavior. Even small commission structures or performance metrics can quietly reshape how advice is given, especially when the store is under pressure to move specific inventory. The result isn't obvious lying. It's subtle nudging, selective framing, and helpful recommendations that always seem to land a little higher on the price ladder. And that's why this chapter hits a nerve. Because once expert advice starts feeling like sales pressure, the entire Micro Center promise collapses. The store stops being a partner in your build and starts feeling like any other retailer trying to maximize the transaction. For a lot of buyers, this is the moment they stop trusting what they hear and start worrying about what happens if something goes wrong after the sale. Because when trust is already shaky, the return counter becomes a battlefield. And according to hundreds of complaints, that's where things really start to unravel. Returns that suddenly become your fault. This is where a lot of buyers say the situation stops being frustrating and starts feeling hostile. Online complaints describe returns that should have been simple, turning into drawn-out arguments, with policies applied differently depending on the store, the manager, or even the day. Customers talk about being told one thing at checkout, another thing at the return counter, and something completely different once a manager gets involved. A common story shows up again and again. A part doesn't work or arrives clearly defective, and instead of a straightforward exchange, the customer is questioned. How was it installed? What system was it used in? Was there any chance it was damaged by the buyer? The tone, according to many reviews, feels less like problem-solving and more like fault-finding. Buyers say the assumption quietly flips from "we sold you a bad part" to "prove you didn't cause this." What makes this worse is the inconsistency. Some customers report smooth, no-hassle returns that feel like the old Micro Center. Others describe being denied for reasons that feel arbitrary, or being told their outside policy when online documentation suggests otherwise. That unpredictability is what breaks trust. When you're spending hundreds or thousands of dollars, you need to know where you stand before something goes wrong, not find out after. And this hits hardest with bundled purchases and open box items. Buyers describe being told that returning one part voids the entire deal, or that an open box issue is harder to prove because the item was already discounted. In other words, the very deals that pulled people in become leverage once there's a problem. Before we go any further, this is where I need you to do something important. If you've ever shopped at Micro Center, or you care about where this is going, hit like and subscribe right now, because the next chapters connect everything you've seen so far, and the ending explains why this keeps happening and what it means for the future of PC retail. You don't want to miss where this goes, because here's the bigger problem most complaints point to. Once returns stop feeling fair, the entire purchase feels risky. People start second-guessing every decision. They hesitate, they overthink, and that's not how a trusted enthusiast store is supposed to make you feel. At this point, a lot of buyers aren't asking, "Did I get unlucky?" They're asking, "What changed inside this company?" And that question leads directly to the part of the scandal that almost nobody sees from the sales floor: the structural shift happening behind the scenes. What changed inside Micro Center and why it matters. When you line up all the complaints, the bundles, the open box issues, the pressure at checkout, the return fights, a question keeps coming up in comment sections and forums. When did Micro Center change? Because to a lot of longtime customers, this doesn't feel like random decline. It feels like a shift in how the store operates. People who've shopped there for a decade or more often describe a clear before and after. Before, the store felt slower, more consultative, almost relaxed. You could talk through a build, ask dumb questions, change your mind, and no one seemed in a rush to move you along. After, buyers say the pace feels tighter, conversations feel shorter, decisions feel guided. Everything feels optimized for the transaction, not the relationship. In complaint threads, some customers, including self-identified former employees, point to familiar retail pressures: expansion into new locations, thinner margins on hardware, vendor incentives tied to moving specific SKUs. None of this requires bad intentions, but all of it quietly changes behavior. When performance is measured by numbers instead of long-term trust, advice naturally shifts toward what closes the sale fastest. That's why so many buyers say the problems feel systemic, not personal. They're not accusing individual employees of being dishonest. In fact, many go out of their way to say the staff was polite, knowledgeable, and clearly trying to help. The issue, according to these complaints, is that the system they're working in no longer rewards the same things it used to. And this explains why the experience varies so wildly from store to store. One location still feels like the old Micro Center. Another feels like a high-pressure sales floor. That inconsistency isn't accidental. It's what happens when a company transitions without clearly resetting expectations for customers or employees. What makes this part uncomfortable is that nothing here is dramatic or illegal. There's no smoking gun memo, No single policy change you can point to and say, that's when it went wrong. Instead, it's a slow drift, one that loyal customers notice first because they remember what it used to feel like. And that's why the outrage keeps growing. People don't feel tricked by a scam. They feel abandoned by a brand they defended for years. A store that once felt built for enthusiasts now feels like it's built on them. Which leads to the most important question of all. Is this actually a scam? Or is it something more subtle? And in some ways, more dangerous? That's what we need to talk about next. This isn't illegal. That's why it works. This is where a lot of people hesitate to call what's happening a scandal, because nothing here looks illegal on paper. Micro Center isn't forging warranties, hiding policies, or refusing returns across the board. In fact, that's exactly why these complaints are so hard to dismiss. Everything technically follows the rules. And that's the point. Online, you'll see frustrated buyers say the same thing in different ways. They didn't break policy, they used it. Bundles are allowed. Open box sales are allowed. Protection plans are optional. Returns are conditional. Each decision on its own is defensible. But when you stack them together, they start working like gears in the same machine. Here's how customers describe the experience. You're nudged into a bundle because standalone stock is limited. You're encouraged to save money with open box. You're warned about failure at checkout and pushed toward a protection plan. And if something goes wrong, policy suddenly becomes very strict, very specific, and very final. No one step is outrageous, but the outcome feels unavoidable. That's why people feel manipulated instead of scammed. A scam is obvious. This is quieter. It relies on momentum, pressure, and the assumption that most customers won't stop mid-purchase to challenge the process. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already invested, financially and emotionally. What really angers longtime shoppers is that this approach depends on trust built years ago. Micro Center doesn't need to trick first-time buyers. It benefits most from experienced builders who walk in confident, expecting the old rules to apply. That confidence is what lets the system work without resistance. And when customers complain online, you can see the same realization play out in real time. People start by defending the store. Then they reread the policy. Then they replay the interaction in their head. And finally, they post something like, "Nothing they did was technically wrong, but it didn't feel right." That feeling is the heart of this scandal. Because when a retailer stays just inside the lines while systematically pushing risk onto the customer, accountability becomes almost impossible to pin down. There's no single policy to protest, no single employee to blame, no clean moment where you can say, "This crossed the line," which is exactly why it keeps happening. And that leaves buyers with one uncomfortable reality. If the system isn't going to change anytime soon, the only real defense is knowing how to navigate it. That's why the next part matters more than anything else in this video. Because there are ways to shop at Micro Center without getting burned, but almost nobody explains them up front. How to shop there without getting burned. If you read through enough Micro Center complaints, a pattern emerges among the people who didn't get burned. It wasn't luck, it was preparation. These buyers didn't walk in assuming the old rules still applied. They treated the store like any other high-stakes purchase environment and protected themselves accordingly. The first rule is simple. Never plan your build around an in-store price you haven't confirmed in writing. Multiple buyers say they drove in expecting a standalone CPU or GPU, only to be told availability had conditions. Screenshot listings. Confirm stock online. If a deal only works as a bundle, assume it will stay that way at the counter. Second, treat OpenBox like a forensic exercise. Complaints consistently mention missing parts and visible damage that should have been caught. Open the box in the store. Check pins, ports, accessories, and serials before you leave. If an employee hesitates or discourages this, that's your cue to walk away. A real deal survives inspection. Third, slow down at checkout. Buyers who felt pressured later say the same thing. They were rushed. if a protection plan is pitched using fear. These fail all the time. This is the only way you're covered. Stop the transaction and ask for the exact written terms. If the explanation gets vague, that's information too. Fourth, assume returns will be scrutinized. Keep boxes, receipts, serial numbers, and photos. Especially for bundles and open box items, document everything. Complaints show that the smoother returns happen when customers can clearly demonstrate the issue without debate. Finally, be willing to leave. This is the hardest one, and it comes straight from buyers who learned the hard way. If something feels off, availability, pressure, tone, don't push through it just because you made the trip. The people who avoided the worst experiences are the ones who walked out and ordered elsewhere. None of this means Micro Center is unusable. It means it's no longer frictionless. The store can still offer good value, but only if you stop treating it like a trusted shortcut and start treating it like a negotiation. And that realization leads to the final question this scandal raises. Because once you zoom out, it becomes clear this isn't just about one retailer. It's about what happens when enthusiast brands grow and forget who made them matter in the first place. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you experienced this yourself? Was Micro Center better back then, or is this being blown out of proportion? Drop your experience in the comments. Those stories matter more than any single video. And if you want more deep dives like this, real complaints, real patterns, no corporate spin, like the video, subscribe, and stay tuned.